Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Why DevOps Won't Automate You Out of a Job. My name is Jamie Bright, and I work on the marketing team here at Chef. I'm pleased to introduce today's speakers, Jason Bloomberg, Industry Analyst and President of Intellex, and Pauly, VP of DevOps at Hearst Business Media. Before we get started, I have a couple of housekeeping items to cover. A recording of this webinar will be available on demand after the live session, accessible through the same link you're using now. We'd also love to hear from you during today's presentation. Jason and Pauly will be answering questions at the end of the session, so please feel free to send those along at any time using the Ask a Question tab on the top of your screen. Also on the top of your screen is an Attachments tab. There you'll find links to additional resources for this topic. For those of you just joining, welcome to today's session, Why DevOps Won't Automate You Out of a Job, presented by Jason Bloomberg and Pauly. Let's get started by filling everybody in. Jason, why did we choose this topic for today's webinar?
Yes, thank you very much, Jamie. It's great to be on this webinar with Chef Software, and that is the last time we will mention Chef Software because we're not talking about tools. Right? We're going to be talking about the organizational and cultural aspects of DevOps. So I'll be asking Pauly to introduce himself in a moment, but I just have a few slides to get us started. So when we think about DevOps, it's important that even though this is an automation-driven phenomenon, that the tools are a key part of the story, it's really not about the tools. Just as the Tin Woodman, he went all the way to the Wizard of Oz to get a heart, and all he got was the clock. The clock wasn't what he was really looking for, and in fact, he always had the heart that he needed. So while automation is an enabler, it's not really about the tools. So this is really what we're going to be focusing on is the cultural and organizational rethink necessary to build and run software at velocity. So where do we start with this story? Well, I like to start with the notion of self-organizing teams. And that phrase is going to be familiar to a large part of our audience because it comes right from the principles behind the Agile Manifesto. So if you think about Agile development, you go back 15 years to this manifesto. Here it is right here in black and white, yellow and white, yellow and black. The best architectures, requirements, and designs emerge from self-organizing teams. So we've always struggled with what that means in the context of Agile because what is the team? It is, whatever the two pizza team that we're focusing on, and what does it mean for them to self-organize? And that's been a challenge for software development, and now we're expanding that beyond just the software development team, and now that becomes the key question. So this is a good starting point, but let's go ahead and move to the broader context here. So if you're a participant on one of these teams, whether you're a developer, QA person, or on the operations side, what does it mean to participate on one of these teams? Well, you need to have a volunteer mindset, right? It's less about being assigned a role, and it's more about figuring out where you as an individual can provide the most value. Another key part of this story is that the team itself isn't necessarily designed ahead of time. It may be a case where individuals on the team need to find other people. So you leverage your own networks in order to find the right people so that you can solve the problem that is facing you. So this is a key part of the story, is having this new mindset about what it means to do your work in a large organization. So if you think about self-organizing teams, well, individuals are collaborating as needed based upon business priorities. So it's not that the boss is saying, okay, you folks collaborate, but more that people are stepping up to the plate and collaborating as needed. So what is the role of management? Management essentially sets the overall business goals, provides the resources, whatever it is you need in terms of people or the tools, as well as funding, obviously. Delineating the constraints, so if there are compliance rules, security rules, or even capacity guidelines for how you deploy software, those are some of the constraints that management has to at least explain to make sure everybody is up to speed on. And then get out of the way. And this is an important part of the story, right? Managers have to step aside because DevOps is essentially focusing on driving decision-making down into the organization, right? The best people to decide what needs to get done are the people who are actually on these teams. So if a manager is assigning people to teams, assigning tasks to teams, they're still organizing the team. So the more self-organized you are, the more the team itself will figure out who the team is and what they should be doing. So what is it now that you need in order to participate on one of these teams in terms of your mindset? Well, the number one requirement is empathy, right? Putting yourself into other people's shoes, focus on what other people need to get their jobs done properly. So this is very important, because if an empathic frame of mind where you're focusing on what other people need in order to be successful, that helps break down some of the organizational challenges that have prevented us from achieving the business velocity that the business has desired and is now the roadblock to DevOps. So the traditional throw it over the wall mentality, the siloed mentality, that's what we need to break down. And the focus here is essentially on supporting other people within the context of the goals of what the task at hand. So once we have this figured out in the software organization, it's important to understand that it's not just about building software. Yes, we have dev, we have ops, we're starting with development and quality assurance and operations, but before long we have to think about security, right? Sec DevOps, and we need to think about, in the digital context, we're looking at the customer experience people, the marketing people, and before long we're thinking in an end-to-end way, where the customer's at one end and the software's at the other end, and we're trying to meet customer needs at velocity, but it's end-to-end, right? It's not just software development anymore. It's driven out of software development, but it's really touching all parts of the organization. So how do we get this to work? How do we have this sort of end-to-end cross-cutting reorganization, especially in large organizations that have so much baggage in terms of hierarchical structure? Well, this is where we need the DevOps virus, right? We want DevOps to be infectious. We want it to be contagious, and we want to spread the love, right? The self-organizational love. And so it's less about software now. It's really about what it means to get people to think empathically and work together to break down silos and to move more quickly to meet the needs of the business. So that's sort of the challenge. And so I'll be asking, Pauly, what he has seen in his organizations, both at Hearst as well as other places he's been. So I like ending with this Steve Jobs quote, allegedly Steve Jobs, at least it's a meme attributed to Steve Jobs, so maybe he said it, maybe he didn't, but it's something he would have said, right? It doesn't make sense to hire smart people and tell them what to do. That's not the role of management, right? Here he is a CEO of a big company. He doesn't tell the people he hires what to do. He hires people because they're the ones that need to figure out what to do, and they should tell management what needs to be done. So this is an essential part of the DevOps mentality, right? That the reason why we hire very smart people to build software is because we need very smart people to tell us not only how to build software, but how the business should run. So the bigger picture, extending past just the software development organization. So let's move on. So the rest of the webinar will essentially be a discussion. We'll get Pauly to speak. So to kick us off, Pauly, why don't you just sort of introduce yourself and introduce Hearst Business Media as well. I mean, people are familiar with the Hearst name from their newspaper business, but your group does quite a bit of different stuff. So that'd be a good place to get started, and then we'll go from there.
All right, great. Thank you so much for having me here today. It's very exciting. A little bit about myself. I've been in technology for over 20 years, and I've started at Hearst only about a year and a half ago. Hearst is a fantastic organization. It's quite large, and you're right. It's probably better known for its publishing side, but its lesser known side is Hearst Business Media, and that's really where I focus. And those are essentially large organizations or business units that deal with large data sets, and so we kind of drive a lot of the things that we do and use every day, but we just kind of don't realize that it's in the background. I was brought on to sort of help in Agile and DevOps, both transformations that these business units had already started. And my role is really just to kind of help them along that journey and provide support and mentorship. And so it's been a really exciting time for me. I've been working with 10 business units. And although I was brought on originally to focus on those business units individually, I realized fairly early on that these business units didn't communicate, at least at the engineering level, between themselves. And so I decided we could focus on a macro approach, a sort of enterprise DevOps community approach that would not only break down the barriers between teams in the business units, but also break down the barriers between the business units themselves. And so that's kind of been what I've been doing for the last year and a half.
Okay, so give us a sense as to the challenges you faced, right? Was it all just very straightforward that, this helping the different groups communicate, or did you run into, the roadblocks along the way? And then how did you deal with those roadblocks?
Well, interestingly, one of the things that I knew going in, but I think I downplayed in my mind a little too much, was the level of difference in cultures. These business units are all over the United States and Europe. And cultures are defined, of course, by the people and what they bring to the organization. So that was probably one of the most fascinating things about the role is seeing all these different cultures and how people react to situations in different ways. And so when you start talking about breaking down barriers between teams, you obviously have these sort of subcultures that coexist inside of an organization. And then you have these macro cultures that also have to be addressed. And so everyone is kind of facing the same problems, right? These are usually interpersonal communication and collaboration and trying to build empathy between teams. And seeing how the different organizational cultures approach those meant that having sort of a unified, one-size-fits-all approach was not going to work. So you had to have a sort of methodology that was very malleable. While it stuck to the main tenets of DevOps, would also allow us to be able to move and shift as we brought these different organizations together.
So interpersonal communication, that's one of those phrases that in some organizations it's not an issue. In other organizations, that, them's fighting words, right? Because you'll have groups that don't see eye to eye, that don't communicate well, and that can be at odds. And you can't just tell people, well, you communicate better, right? So in your experience, not necessarily at Hearst, but I know, some of your other experience, you've done quite a bit of work in other organizations as well. How do you deal with situations where, where communication is has stopped and you have, now you have to sort of somehow move the organization forward?
Yeah, I'm reminded of one organization in particular before I started at Hearst. It was I worked at, and the developers and operations teams, really there was a substantial amount of sort of vitriolic hatred between them, and it was deep-seated. In fact, it's sort of one of those feuds that run so deep that no one really remembers where it started. But they have to live with it day in and day out. And I tried a couple of different approaches to get them communicating with each other. We had a rather substantial problem where everyone was sort of very siloed in their skill set. So a network engineer didn't do anything but the firewall, as an example. And so I said, okay, well, I need to start building some empathy and getting some communication between these two teams. And I tried a couple of different approaches. The one that worked best was creating a common language between the two teams, which was difficult because, again, everyone was sort of siloed in their own, workspace, even within, say, operations as an example. And so the effort in the beginning was just to create some sort of common language. And to do that, I created common goals. And I started with the stage environment. It was the one that everyone had to touch. And so you had the typical problem of stage running out, drifting away from production. We told everyone don't go into stage and mess with it. That was supposed to be the step prior to going to production. But people would still go in there and test and play around and end up creating an environment that didn't mimic production. So I brought the teams together and said, we need to solve this problem, and we need to solve it together because everyone is affected by this. So we created sort of a common goal or a common cause around this. I use the analogy that I think of developers as artists, right? Product owners come in and say, this is what I want the painting to look like. And then we give them tools, and then we want them to create, literally make something from nothing. And so that's kind of the language they speak in. And I think of ops individuals as being more like doctors. more often than not, they end up being like ER doctors, right? Something's happened to the website, it's offline, we're losing money, and they rush the application in on a stretcher and a gurney, and we're like, just stabilize the patient first. We'll figure out, what was the cause of the accident later. And so both very important roles, but they're different languages. And so then we take them, and in DevOps, we tend to sometimes throw them together at a dinner party and say, all right, have a good time and talk to each other. And the problem is they're sort of speaking somewhat different languages. So for the stage environment, I said, okay, I need to unify them together behind a goal. We have a goal, we have a common cause. How can we now leverage some way to bring them closer together in a common language? And we started looking at the tooling and the process that we would use to build this environment. We wanted to take it away from a static environment to more of a push button build as you need environment. So that meant that they had to learn, and we moved it into the cloud. It seemed like the logical thing to do with a sort of ephemeral environment. And so by moving it into the cloud, we had to learn Amazon together. We had to learn configuration management and consistency in that way together. And that allowed them to sort of have a common language at that dinner party where they could break the ice. Right? And of course, there were other issues that came up along the way, but the idea was you started building these sort of bonds where people could help each other and build each other up, so that when you ran into those, you already had those pre-existing relationships. And so when there was an outage or there was a problem in stage, as an example, we could all come together as one unified team to address it. It also meant that everyone had a stake in the outcome. Everyone had a seat at the table. And much like you were saying earlier, it was the team. It was a team goal. So it wasn't an individual goal. It was a team goal, which meant everyone had to come together to achieve the goal. It couldn't be done as an individual.
So you mentioned that you took some steps to implement automation, and that in particular changed the role of the operations people, and that ties into the title of our webinar, right? The operations people in particular may be worried that DevOps will automate them out of a job, but is that what you're seeing? I mean, the role is shifting. Do we need fewer people? Are they losing jobs? I mean, what is your take on the answer to the question we posed in the title of the webinar?
So I've done a lot of these transformations, hundreds of engineers at a lot of different organizations. And I'm going to speak from my own experience. I've never seen anyone automated out of a job. I've seen the roles change, as you say. A great example there would have been in the situation where we just spoke. We moved the success in stage, we moved to production and moved it into Amazon. What that meant was the network engineers who were accustomed to running a substantial number of switches and load balancers and firewalls now had to change their mindset. Now, it doesn't mean that they were automated out of a job. In fact, we did a substantial amount of automation on the network side in Amazon, right? We used CloudFormation to build out all the network and security stuff, and we used configuration management to manage that going forward. And so instead, we focused on building their skill set up and out. So it would be different, I suppose, if you said, okay, we're going to automate all this, and we just don't need you anymore. That's just not the case. I've never ever seen an organization that said, you know what we have? We have too much resource. We have too much money. We have too many people. We don't know what to do, right? That just doesn't ever happen. It's usually the opposite, right? It's always like, God, if I had more people, right? If I had more resources, we could do so much more. The important thing and the important aspect here is, yeah, the role may change, but if the organization takes care of its people and it mentors them and it teaches them and gives them opportunity, they can change with that. And in fact, again, automation, the idea of automation is to reduce defects, of course, but it's also to free up the average engineer so that they can do the things that add real value. Going to the data center and looking at the blinking lights on the stand to make sure the hard drives are okay doesn't really add a ton of value. If we can free up those mundane tasks, now you have time to actually innovate. That's another thing I hear a lot of. I would love to innovate, I just don't have time to do it. So really automation is an effort to try and free that time up so that you do have an opportunity to innovate.
Okay, so as a leader, I'm sure you've run into situations where, people have to change their roles and they resist that change, right? Some people will be all over it. They prefer to do this more strategic, more innovative work, but others, not everybody is like that, right? So, give us some advice both for people who may be uncomfortable with change, as well as for some of the leaders on this call who may be in your shoes saying, well, how do I deal with these people who are, even though I'm giving them these opportunities, they're still resistant to this kind of change?
You know what? That's a great question. And so that's a very common scenario, right? Where, you have a situation where somebody says, look, I've invested a substantial amount of my career and time in being the best COBOL programmer I can be. Now, it doesn't mean that you have to become a PHP programmer or Ruby or Rust or Go or insert, language here. That's okay. You can still have a long and generous career in COBOL. It just means that maybe that career isn't here. And I think we tend to put a negative spin on that, but I don't believe that's accurate. I really wish we would stop doing that. If you have someone that you've given every opportunity to make this transition with the organization, and they just simply say, it's just not for me. That's okay. That's not a big deal. It's not a negative. I really look at these things like relationships, because they are. And so if it gets to a point in the relationship where it's just not working out and you need to see other people, that's okay. In fact, it really is a positive thing. You spend a substantial amount of your time at work. Wouldn't you want to enjoy it as much as possible? I mean, it is work. That's why they pay you. But, if you can make it as fun as possible and as intrinsically rewarding as possible, why wouldn't you do that? And I feel that it's okay for us to get to a point where we're like, you need to find an organization where you're happy and the organization is happy, and we need the same thing. Now, I really feel like that's only okay if you really have done everything in your power as a leader to support and build that person up. I mean, that is our job as leaders. It's really the only job. Once you move up to a position where you're no longer hammering on the keyboard developing code every day, or, logging into, systems and doing systems admin work, your role is to support the people that rely on you day in and day out. And so I think if you do the due diligence and really give that a fair shake, then I think you can both in good conscience say, okay, well, how about I try and help you find a spot where they need a programmer with your skill set? This is kind of where we get into, I think we focus a lot on breaking down the barriers between teams. So that's kind of where DevOps started, right? The throw it over the wall mentality from Dev to Ops. And we need to also focus on breaking down our own barriers between skills. It doesn't mean that you're not going to be, skilled in one particular area. You want to become an expert, programmer in Ruby. That's fine, absolutely fine. And you can do that and have a great career at it, but it means that you're more limited, right? Whereas if you have skills across the board, but you specialize in one thing, that gives you a lot more flexibility. It also allows you, especially if say you're a network engineer again, right? And you learn some development skills. Maybe it's just scripting. In order for us, we keep asking engineers to be empathetic towards one another. It's really hard to do that if you don't really understand what the other person's job is or how difficult it is. One way to do that is to learn aspects of it, and maybe even learn how to do it, at least at a rudimentary skill set. So this is where I've been focusing a lot of work around individual contributors, is we want to build empathy. And we say this all the time, and it's really kind of hard because it seems like a lot of talks and a lot of conferences, people just kind of throw that at you. It's like, well, be more empathetic. Okay, well, how? Give me some, applicable skills, some ideas that I can get started in becoming empathetic. It's a learned skill to some degree, just like communication. And so, ways that we've been doing that, again, is like cross-functional teams, getting people, greater visibility into what the other team is doing. We do value stream mapping so that people understand where they live within the value stream, and they get to hear the stories of the other departments in the value stream so that they can understand the sort of difficulties and troubles and trials and tribulations that the other teams face. And the amazing thing is occasionally you'll have an ops person learn some of the dev world, and they'll fall in love with it and go to school and become a developer. And we have actual programs inside of Hearst to enable that.
So I have a feeling that many people in our audience today are listening to you and saying, wow, that guy Pauly, I wish he was my boss, right? Or I wish my boss was more like him, right? But the fact of the matter is a lot of times bosses really don't have the perspective you have, don't have the same sort of focus on the sort of the human-centric focus that you bring to your job. So what can people do, either if they're individual contributors, to sort of help, if the leaders in their organization aren't on the right page, or even more importantly, for the various leaders, whether it's the Scrum Masters, the project managers, the directors of IT, or the VP level leaders, what can those people do to sort of get on the right page with all of this stuff? There's so many different moving parts here. So what's some advice, sort of generally speaking, for leaders as well as the people who are struggling with leaders who aren't getting it?
Well, I think you had it right early, right? Whereas everyone should try to be an evangelist, and there's going to be, your results may vary, of course, right? Because some people will take that inherently, and other people will struggle with it. If you're looking towards a boss, as an example, I'll use my own use case. You look to a boss and say, okay, I get all this stuff. I'm going to conferences, I'm watching webinars, and podcasts, and I'm inundating myself with all these new ideas and innovation and how we can work faster and better if we just work more together. How do I convince my boss of this? And I love the idea of getting, especially higher level leadership, if you're not getting that buy-in, not from your direct manager, but from higher level, but your manager too, to some degree, find the conferences that are geared towards them and convince them to go to at least one. For us, I convinced a bunch of leadership to go to DevOps Enterprise Summit down in San Francisco last year, and we had a lot of aha moments in that. And I'd love to use this sort of story where it's important sometimes for them to hear it from someone else, someone outside of your organization, and especially if they can hear it from their peers. And so I love to tell this story. I have a son, and when he was 5, I was trying to teach him how to ski. And I was doing all the stuff that you would normally expect in skiing, right? We're doing French fries and pizza and showing him how to turn. And it was just abject misery, right? I mean, it was just a miserable time for both of us. And he was just falling down and throwing fits, and it wasn't working out at all. And so my wife recommended, hey, how about we get a ski instructor? And I'm like, okay, I guess so, So we get a ski instructor, and what does he do? He says the exact same stuff I said. Only my son, claps his hand and looks over at me and goes, geez, Dad, why didn't you say that? And I'm like, oh, you serious? And so basically he's hearing the same story only for $100 an hour that I told. So it's usually at this point in the story where I ski off to get my hot toddy. But the idea of hearing it outside of your own org seems to really work well, and especially if they can sit in the audience with other peers around them, because it really reinforces the value proposition. Now, there are going to be situations, so let's be frank and honest here. There are going to be situations where you have a boss that just doesn't believe in any of this stuff. I was working with an organization, and the QA was all manual, 100% manual. And I tried to convince the VP over there that the QA team really should focus on looking at some automated tests and injecting some security tests into that automated structure as well. And the response from the manager of QA was, no, I'm just not going to do it. I like this. I'm a caped hero. I swoop in. I save the day. I know how all this works, and this is where all of my value to the organization lies. And at that point, there was no amount of cajoling or coaxing that would work to get the individual to move. And that's going to happen sometimes. Again, you're dealing with people and emotions, and the fear of loss of control or power or respect is a powerful thing, especially if the organization is well established.
So another situation that is appallingly common, and I see this with organizations that are on their road to implementing DevOps, right? So they're somewhere, they haven't quite figured it out, but they're on their way. Is the executive who frantically calls the team and says, well, that DevOps stuff, I know that's going to help us out, but we have some sort of short-term business thing. We have to build this app really fast, or this, fix this website, or there's some sort of business priority that now puts DevOps on the back burner. And that sort of defeats the whole purpose, right, of DevOps. So how should organizations deal with that kind of situation, in terms of understanding the strategic importance of DevOps in the face of changing business priorities?
It really ends up becoming a situation of trade-offs, right? And so in that situation, and I've unfortunately been in that situation a couple of times, and it usually ends up being the product team sort of going up against the dev team. And, I go a little bit higher and we go to the executive leadership and we talk about the business value of DevOps. And so it's very easy to find, there's tons of research that will show you the business value around DevOps, lower defect rate, higher response times, compressed MTTR. There's tons of data points that you can use. But you need to be evangelizing to the leadership in a way that they can consume that data. So you can't go to them and talk about, the percent code coverage, and you don't want to get too into the weeds, right? But the idea is that you want to evangelize and win them over so that they understand that if we do this, we will be able to get product out faster. Now, that means that if you're incentivizing your product managers to get a certain number of features out every quarter in order to get a bonus, that you need to reevaluate incentives. If you're incentivizing developers to complete a certain number of sprints with a certain degree of, a defect rate, again, you want to kind of align those goals. But oftentimes I've seen those two teams, especially the leadership of those two teams, come to a loggerheads where they just can't seem to agree. And that's where if you can get the buy-in from the executive leadership, the CTO can say, okay, this is, again, back to team goals. So stop thinking of product and dev as two different teams. Let's start breaking down the barriers between those two teams now, getting them working together on a common goal, and making sure that we're incentivizing them to operate as one team where they work together. We're starting to see more and more where product will throw requirements over the wall, sort of like we used to see with dev and ops. And then dev gets disenfranchised with, well, I have no say in what we build, and you're changing, you're pivoting every single time mid-sprint, and this is burning me out. And so, again, I think that's where if we can come together on sort of common goals there, that seems to be very powerful. Just keep in mind who your audience is. You want to be an evangelist for DevOps, you're going to have three tiers. You're going to have individual contributors, you have middle management, and you're going to have executive leadership. And each one has a slightly different goal, of course, and how you approach, evangelizing DevOps is a little bit different. You need to think about how your audience consumes that data.
Yeah, the challenge of incentives, that is a very difficult challenge, because as you mentioned, you have these different levels and different incentives depending upon where you are in the organization, and the wrong incentives will drive the wrong behavior. And I actually have a great story, and since we have a little bit of extra time, this is a story from, I don't know, about 8 or 10 years ago, and I was hired to provide architectural advice to this big company. So I go in, and it turns out what they really wanted was a bunch of documents. Right, so about 20 different physical deliverables, this roadmap document, and these service contracts, and it was this whole list of documents. And I was talking to them. It's like, this is not going to help you with your architecture. It's going to help somewhat, but there's so much more to architecture than documents. And it's like I couldn't really figure out why they wanted to pay me all this money for something that it was just a lot of paperwork, and and I couldn't really understand why they really saw value in this paperwork. And then the project moved on, and I was crossing each deliverable off the list, and and it got toward the end of the year, and so in December they approved the final deliverable that I had given them, the last one that was the most challenging to put together, and then it turned out, I figured out, they finally told me what their motivation was, and what had happened was early in the year, in the calendar year, they got together as a team and established their goals as a team, the architecture team, and their goals for the year were to complete this list of documents. And about midway through the year, they realized they couldn't do it themselves, and that's why they brought me in, so that I could do these documents for them. And they signed off in December. Why? Because they got their bonuses, because they had completed these documents. They weren't going to use the documents for anything. They simply were incentivized to have the documents. So it's a very expensive lesson that the wrong incentives will drive the wrong behavior. And we see this now happening with DevOps, right? That because DevOps is rather fluid, it's not really clear what you want to incentivize. It's not obvious. So, and different organizations are trying to achieve different goals, right? I mean, some people look at Amazon and, they have 3 releases a minute of their e-commerce engine. It's like, do we really need to have, is continuous delivery mean 3 times a minute to us? Right? And it may or may not, right? Continuous delivery, continuous integration, that word continuous means different things for different people. So it'd be interesting to sort of get your take on, since you've helped with DevOps in different organizations, how are sort of the different goals of how are the goals of DevOps varied from one organization to the next? And what does that tell you about how to do DevOps right? I mean, what is doing DevOps right? Does that even mean anything?
Yes, that's a great point. That's a good story too. A great example of one of Mary Poppendieck's definitions of waste, right? But here's the thing: is I think because DevOps is so fluid that it's wrong to think of it as a list of things that you check off, and instead I like to think of it more as a framework that you adapt to your organization. Foundationally, DevOps is really about just being kind to each other and trying to understand and collaborate and communicate, right? That's at the very base level of DevOps. You layer on top of that a lot of other things like automation, right? Continuous integration, continuous deployment, delivery. And then that's where we start getting into Agile and start trying to build into the concepts of velocity and how do we increase velocity while reducing defects. But at the base layer, if you're just starting out, literally, start out with communication. When I talk about evangelizing, again, I'll go back to it. When people say, hey, I want to be better at DevOps. I want to really embrace DevOps and to be part of my career. I think that's a fantastic thing. Start with evangelizing. And by that, I mean start with evangelizing yourself. So start looking at, am I myopic in my skill set, in my approach and how I think? And then start spreading that out. The interesting thing about success, so when we're talking about DevOps, is if you start doing something and it starts really working well for your team and the value is very apparent and evident, other people will start to ask questions and want to know how and why that's working for you. So that can be that grassroots groundswell for yourself. You don't have to get up on top of a stump and start shouting at the world. You can let your actions and your results speak for themselves. But in order to start doing that, you really have to be introspective first. This is especially important for middle managers, right? Middle managers have an incredible position to influence, but rarely seem to have the power to do so. And so as senior leaders, we have to make sure that middle managers are empowered to make these changes. This is where we're talking about pushing that decision-making out closer to where the work is actually done. It falls right back into your comment earlier, the Steve Jobs quote, allegedly, as, you hired smart people, let them do their work and get out of the way. And so I really feel like, if you want to have a great career in DevOps, start thinking about what DevOps means for you and then see what it means for your organization. Ideally, you want to make those as congruent as possible for you to be successful in that organization. And so, DevOps is really about again, trying to be empathetic, finding other people. I guarantee you, if you're in any organization of any size, there are other people who are feeling the same way you are. Get together, start forming, so there's like internal DevOps days for your teams. Start the conversation, begin the communication between the teams. Even if it happens at an individual contributor level, that's fine. Don't feel like you're not empowered or able to enact change just because you're not a manager or a vice president.
So we have about 20 minutes left, so we'd like to open it to questions from the audience. So I believe there's a question button on your screen. Feel free to type in a question. If we don't have any questions now, I can come up with one, but let's see if we have anybody who's game to be our first question. Do we have any questions yet? Let's see. No questions yet? Oh, come on. You can come up with questions. So, well, here's a question. So one of the stories coming out of Google is that people are encouraged to take a certain percentage of their time and work on special projects. I don't know, it's 20%, something like that. That makes a lot of sense, right? It's a very innovative company and they're driving innovation. On the downside, there's also stories coming out of Google saying that that 20% is on top of your 40 hours a week. So it's like, well, okay, do all your work during normal business hours and then stay, on evenings and weekends to innovate for us, for no extra money. So it could go either way. But but in the context of DevOps, I mean, this is part of the challenge, right? That on the one hand, people just have their work to do. There's certain, requirements from the business that are pretty straightforward. On the other hand, you're also asking people to innovate, and innovation driven out of the DevOps organization can be strategically critically important for the organization. That can be really the difference between a large organization successfully navigating digital transformation and falling behind the competition. So what is some of your advice to how to balance that? If you're an individual contributor and you're being asked to innovate, how do you know how much to do, as opposed to doing other work that's on your plate that may not be identified as innovative?
So let me answer in three different parts, because I want to start with I'm not a huge fan of and only because I haven't seen it work real well in organizations, probably outside of Google. It doesn't sound like it's working that well there either. And that is this sort of amorphous, like 20% a week. The problem with that is a lot of leadership really looks towards metrics and how do we gauge and measure these results. Well, 20% is hard to measure, right? So what we did instead was, okay, so for 1 hour a day, 2 hours a day, right, 2 hours a week, and it's a dedicated time slot where you can be heads down on a pet project. So instead of saying 20% here and there, you know how contextual shifting works, right? I mean, it's incredibly disruptive. You get into a pet project and somebody walks out and says, hey, the website's down. So what we did was create goalies so that you can have that time and other people will manage incidents that happen in real time. And so having that dedicated time and having it as a walled garden, way more effective from my experience. As an individual contributor, this is where it's really important to get out of your box and out of your shell and go and talk to people. You have an innovative idea, don't cultivate it on your own. Start getting out, and you'll be able to tell from what other people say in their input whether or not this idea has merit for that organization. If it does, and you can show a value proposition, not only can you then evangelize that idea up the chain, you can do it horizontally. Other people will get excited about it too. I was at Chef for about 4 years, and that was kind of how we operated. If somebody had a really neat idea, they would, at the demo, we do a weekly demo, you'd bring it up and say, what do you guys think about this? And so everyone would have some input, we'd sort of have a brainstorming session. And if the idea had a lot of merit, then it got more resources, right? We would sort of double down on that idea, at least, if nothing else, to go through a PDFA loop once or twice to see how far we could take it. And then we wouldn't fall victim to sunk cost fallacy. If it wasn't working, we would just pull the plug. And the nice thing about that is there's no hard feelings, right? It didn't work out this time, let's try something else. As an individual contributor, you can glean a lot of information about where that fits in the prioritized list of tasks for the overall business. This is also where it's important for the business to be very clear on the context, the why of the business goals. that will help you. If you make those very public and very clear and transparent, it's a little easier for me to say, oh, cool, this feature I'm thinking about developing, which could actually create its own product over time, would fit really nicely into those business goals because they've been distilled down to everyone in a transparent fashion.
Yeah, I love that horizontal evangelizing idea because that's what I meant by the DevOps virus, right? You can expand that evangelism activity to any group in the organization as appropriate. You may be talking to the product team or customer experience or whatever the group is. So that's a great way to do that, to spread the love of DevOps is to bring new innovative ideas. And obviously if they aren't very good, then they won't go very far. But because you're evangelizing them across groups, the really good ideas will gain traction, and that's a way to tell if they're good ideas. So we do have some great questions. Let's get to them. So first question, what are the primary skills you look for in hiring DevOps folks when they're new hires? You look for just dev people and ops people, or, I mean, it's not like people have lots of DevOps on their resumes, right? So how do you hire people?
So for me, I'm usually looking for a core competency, right? So let's say I need an operations engineer who's going to be on call, or I need, again, like a developer for .NET or Rust or whatever the language happens to be. Now that's sort of the primary thing that I need. I don't tend to have, I'm using air quotes here, DevOps team. I tend to focus more on leveling the playing field by calling everyone engineers. And we all work as one team together, ops and dev. We won't get into the rabbit hole of the no ops movement and all that stuff in this, but the idea then is I start looking at what are the other skills that you have? What are the pet projects you do at home? Do you play with Arduino boxes and Raspberry Pis, or did you go to like a local college to get some credits on how to run and learn networking? This is the type of person that would be willing and open to try different things and not just kind of come in and be very, very siloed around their only core competency. So again, DevOps is about reaching outside of your main skill set and being willing to learn new skills and sort of expand those over time. And then I, as a leader, want to provide every opportunity to you to do that. If you come to me and say, hey, I don't know Rust, it seems like a pretty interesting new language. I would love to go to this 2-day course. Now, here's the thing. In some organizations, they would say, no, that doesn't fit in driving our bottom line. And so as a leader, you have to be willing to fight for these things and say, no, actually, it does drive the bottom line, because what it means is that we are expanding the skills of our employees and we're showing them that we have faith in them and that we believe. Who knows? Maybe the next great product for us could be written in Rust. Nobody knows that yet. So, I think that's kind of what I look for. That sort of mentality of, I love the mentality of when I approach someone and say, hey, I need you to go take a look at the DNS server as an example, right? Something's wrong with the CNAME in there. And instead of the person saying, I've never done anything with DNS, no idea, it's not my job. I'm looking for someone that's like, you know what, I've never done that before, but let me give it a shot and see what I can figure out, and then maybe we can put our heads together and figure out a solution. That's a DevOps mentality right there.
It makes a lot of sense. So here's a great question. Have you seen DevOps fail at an organization, and if so, why?
Yeah, actually, so a small organization, and this is going to sound funny, right, because it was a small company that had built a product, and the product sold really well, but atrophied very quickly. And mainly because the folks who wrote it, they didn't continue to build their own skill set. So the product was still written in VB6, and very, very waterfall, right? I mean, just definition of waterfall. And when I came in and started talking about, and they actually brought me in to talk to them about how can we, refactor and move past this. And I said, well, I think your bigger problem isn't the fact that you're on VB6. It's the fact that you're not really looking forward in your processes, and you don't really have a lean approach to these things. And so moving to another language isn't necessarily going to fix all those problems. And that was really seen as an idea that was sort of based as a heretic, right? They were like, that's crazy. We've done this forever, and like it's always worked for us. There's no reason for us to change. Now, at that point, there's all this market research, all this evidence that kind of, dispels that. And if nothing else, at least be willing to give it a shot. And since they weren't, they said no. They said, no, we're not going to do it, and we're going to stick with what we have. And when I made the comment of right now you're the incumbent, what happens when an upstart comes along and is able to produce software and get it out, features out faster than what they were doing, which was 90 days. The answer was, we have loyal customers, they'll never leave us. And so, there's only so much you can do in that situation. Sadly, that is exactly what happened. A young startup came along, was able to give the customer what they wanted for the same or lesser price, and they were getting the features that they demanded months ahead of schedule. So, their market was eventually eroded and they went under. So.
Interesting. So here's another question, and I like this one because it's a shout out to an article that I wrote, or one like it. The question is, what is your guest's opinion on, our opinion on DevOps versus ITIL? And then reference a Forbes article, and I did write an article on this question, although there could have been another article this person is referring to. But what is your take on that? ITIL is so process heavy, it tends to slow things down, but DevOps wants to move fast. But ITIL is often mandated in the IT organization. So what have you seen about that?
Gene Kim said something about this a couple of years ago, and I love what he said, which was they're not mutually exclusive. You don't have to do ITIL or DevOps, and I really believe that. I think you can have them coexist. I think the problem is, from my experience, so I was, ITIL, I was forced to go to ITIL certification at a previous job. So I was ITIL version 2 certified, in green belt and all those fads. And so, the interesting thing was the mandate was we had to follow ITIL to the letter, right? Which failed miserably because it's really a framework. It's designed to be implemented in the manner that best suits and fits your organization. And I think DevOps, especially right now, the reason that I love it is it's still somewhat amorphous. And so it can mold around ITIL. Now, will ITIL cut into the efficacy of DevOps? Yes, it can. If you're so, as an example, if you have 3 boards to get through for every change request, yeah, it's going to be really hard to build velocity. And so you kind of want to have a balance there. I don't think that you have to completely get rid of ITIL. I think some of the ideas in ITIL are solid and they make a lot of sense. I think that if you take anything to the extreme, that's when you start seeing the diminishing returns.
Yeah, I would definitely concur with that. There are some organizations where, ITIL has really slowed down the DevOps efforts, but they often focus too much on the DevOps or the ITIL as written. They're following the book as opposed to thinking about how they need to modify or update ITIL to meet their changing needs, right? To meet the continuous CI/CD, continuous integration delivery needs that the business now has. Other organizations figured out how to do that, and one that is worth looking at is ING, the financial services firm. And some of the folks have gotten ITIL to work with DevOps at ING. They've been on the conference circuit, so you can Google them and find some of their presentations. And sure enough, they basically took a less dogmatic view of ITIL and said, well, we need ITIL because we have, regulatory compliance requirements and there's certain things in there that help us stay on track. But we need to modify it so that it doesn't slow us down. And that can be difficult because what we really need is like a handbook for how to modify ITIL, right? Sort of ITIL, star, and we don't really have that, but so we sort of have to figure it out on our own. But over time, ITIL will evolve as well. And but those, looking to the group that drives ITIL to keep up with the times, I mean, that's always lags behind. So there's still some sort of careful work that needs to be done. So let's see, we have about 5 minutes left, so it may be just time for one more. Here somebody is mentioning that they have a formal DevOps team, and it was highly successful. They delivered good work, but it came at a cost. And the cost was a rift that formed between the ops team, who was the primary customers, who are now doing their own DevOps work. So I guess the ops group has DevOps and the dev team has DevOps. So you have these competing DevOps, and it's becoming a huge mess. So can you give them some advice? I mean, it sounds like they sort of went down the wrong path here, but what can they do to get on the right track?
Yeah, this is kind of one of those things where you have the war between doing DevOps and labeling DevOps, right? Again, I don't believe that calling yourself DevOps is a problem, provided that you're doing DevOps as we see it, right? Which is you're not creating an artificial silo, like a third silo between teams. In the situation where that occurs, and yeah, we've seen it happen, and there's a high degree of efficacy there. But this is, again, one of those things where the ends don't justify the means, right? It's because it's created this animosity, which is the very thing DevOps was seeking to avoid and dispel. What's worked for us is flattening the org back out and pulling that title back out of there and spreading the work across the teams and having shared accountability. It's tough because you start getting folks who are very proud of what they've accomplished, and they feel like that is diminished if it's sort of pushed outward. You just kind of have to work through that. If you can get in a situation where you don't do that beforehand, and you enable everyone to do DevOps and everyone to come together, and you allow people to make decisions and be innovative and take risks as a larger team. This is where that team goals comes into play. That is ideal. I don't see any reason, and again, obviously I don't know the person who asked, certainly if you want to talk to me offline, I'd love to work with you on it. But the idea is that your organization saw the value of DevOps, but they weren't necessarily sure how to implement. And so they created a team and said, all right, we want you to automate things. We want you to go through and do test automation. We want to do all those things that pull that value in from DevOps. The problem is they're getting to work on all the cool, fun stuff, and everyone else is still working on the mundane ancillary tasks. And that's where the disenfranchisement comes from. So we really kind of want to spread that out.
Yeah, so there's this interesting common theme here. We talk about DevOps, we talk about ITIL, and mention Agile, and this was something that was also part of my architecture course in the last decade when I was teaching people about SOA, and that is that you want to be iconoclastic, not dogmatic, about whatever it is you're doing. Any of these have frameworks and books and rules, and you can take your ITIL book or your DevOps book, and you can say, well, we need to follow what's in this book. Happens with TOGAF in the architecture world. We got to do all these steps, and if you take that dogmatic approach, it'll never be a good fit. You'll get bogged down, and you'll have arguments over whether or not you're doing, Agile the right way. Agile is a big part of this. So is this really Agile? Is this not really Agile? Is this really DevOps? Not really DevOps? That's the wrong argument, right? That argument is just taking you in the wrong direction. You want to be iconoclastic, right? You want to pick and choose the rules, principles, frameworks that work in your situation, throw out the ones that don't, modify the ones that you need to modify, and realize that you're going to have to continue to change things as time moves on as well. So even if you modify something and say this is what we're doing, you have to revisit that periodically because you may need to update that. So that's taking the iconoclastic approach, and this is important for any of these supposed sets of best practices. So, and the list is not complete, right? So whether it's
right.
ITIL, DevOps, or the next thing to come along, just because somebody writes a book on it or, people agree this is the best way to do things, take that with a grain of salt. It may or may not meet your needs. And even if it does, it may not continue to meet your needs as things change.
Absolutely. No,
so one more minute. Final comments.
My final comment is don't give up, right? If you're in an organization where you feel like you're working so hard to get headway, just look for like-minded individuals. If you're an individual contributor, start the groundswell, right? And do that by finding like-minded individuals and find a project that adds value to the business and go ahead and do that. And then when you have some value, you can take that and get buy-in from the top. If you're a middle manager, treat your people right. Just if you want to enable DevOps as a middle manager, get in there and let them do the work and listen to them and let them make decisions.
Well, very good. Well, I think we need to wrap up. So, Jamie, do you want to wrap us up, take us out, or do you want me to wrap up?
Yeah, thanks, guys. I want to just thank you to Jason and Pauly for the great discussion, and to our audience for joining us today. We'd love to have you rate this presentation and leave us any of your comments in the feedback and the ratings. Thanks again, guys, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.